17 is a really hard question. This is a what we call a necessary assumption question in the curriculum. And the question stem says, which one of the following is an assumption required by the argument? So as we learn in our necessary assumptions curriculum, that necessary assumptions are necessary because if the argument is true, if the premises are true and the conclusion is true, then this assumption has already been made. This assumption had better be true. So the other way to think about that is if this assumption were false, if you negate this assumption, it would wreck your argument. It would make it so that your premises could not possibly support your conclusion. Right? So that's the theory that we go into more detail in the curriculum about how to approach necessary assumption questions. But here, let's take this one as an example, as an exercise. You'll learn a lot about it just from this question. It's a really tough question again. So let's read. When exercising muscles in one's back, it is important in order to maintain a healthy back to exercise muscles on the opposite sides equally. So that's a statement that turns out to be the conclusion. Now we don't know it yet, but we don't know that's the conclusion yet. But let's just see what it's saying. If you want to maintain a healthy back, you have to exercise muscles on the opposite sides of the spine equally. That's what the statement is saying. After all, that's how we know this is a conclusion. Because after all tells us in our grammar lessons, we talk about after all and other words that introduce premises. So after all is introducing a reason why. And that's also an indicator for why it's a conclusion. Why should I believe this statement? Why should I believe that to maintain a healthy back, I need to exercise muscles on the opposite sides of my spine equally? Well, they're going to tell me. So premise right here. They're going to tell me why that is the case. Well, because balanced muscle development. Now, that's a new idea. Balanced muscle development, okay, is needed to maintain a healthy back. So if you want a healthy back, you need to have balanced muscle development. But then, do you already kind of sense the gap? Before even reading the rest of this, you already kind of said you have to, because that's not sensing the gap. Conflating ideas, failing to make distinctions between ideas is how the LSAT gets you time and time again. In our conclusion, we said to maintain a healthy back, you need to exercise muscles on opposite sides of the spine equally. Now, is that the same thing as balanced muscle development? See, because then this premise tells us to maintain a healthy back, you need balanced muscle development. Can I have balanced muscle development if I don't exercise muscles on the opposite side of my spine equally? Right? Because you see, the answer had better be no, you can't. Because if I could, then this premise won't support its conclusion. Because then this balanced muscle development, what does this have to do with exercising opposite sides of my spine equally? Right, okay, so since, so this adds another twist to it. Since is also, in our grammar lessons, you learn that since also introduces premises, but since always attaches a conclusion, and here's the conclusion. So how do we have two conclusions? Well, this is what we call a sub-conclusion, major conclusion distinction. So this becomes a major premise that supports our major conclusion, major premise slash sub-conclusion, supported by a minor premise. So that there's sort of an embedded layer of argument. We accept this premise. As a result of accepting this premise, we accept this conclusion slash premise, and as a result of accepting this, we accept this. So that's the support structure there. Now, of course, there's a gap in there. But let's read this. Balanced muscle development is needed to maintain a healthy back. Why should we believe that? Because the muscles on opposite sides of the spine must pull equally in opposing directions to keep the back in proper alignment and protect the spine. That's why we believe this statement. So it's premise, sub-conclusion, major premise to support the main conclusion. We already identify the gap. The gap is the idea between balanced muscle development and exercising muscles on the opposite side of the spine equally. Right? That's the gap. So what must be true? Muscles on opposite sides of the spine that are equally well developed will be enough to keep the back in proper alignment. Okay, that's fine. I mean, if it's not enough, that's still okay. Right? It doesn't wreck our argument. You also need other things, like, for example, not getting crushed by a boulder. Right? That's also necessary to keep your back in proper alignment. That's fine. Right? So this, you see what we did? We just negated this answer choice and we say, how does this affect our argument? It doesn't. It doesn't make our premises irrelevant to our conclusion. It doesn't make it so that our premises can't support our conclusion. So A is not right. B says exercising muscles on opposite sides of the spine unequally tends to lead to unbalanced muscle development. That has to be true. This has to be true. Otherwise, you're making this premise irrelevant for this conclusion. Right? You see, our premise here is saying balanced muscle development is needed to maintain healthy back. You see, how do we get balance? How do I make my back muscles develop in a balanced way? What's being presumed is that I have to exercise my back muscles equally, right? So if B weren't true, if it's not the case that exercising muscles on the opposite side of the spine unequally tends to lead to imbalance. So in other words, if I exercise my back unequally, yet I could still get to balanced muscle development, then you see, then this premise has no way to support this conclusion anymore. Right? That's why B is the correct answer for this. That's why it's a necessary assumption. It's a really hard concept because you got to draw this distinction in your mind between the idea of balanced muscle development versus exercising your back muscles on opposite sides of the spine equally. Those are two very different ideas, and that's the gap we need to fill. C says, provided that one exercise muscles opposite equally, one will generally have a healthy back. But I can say the same thing with A that I said for A, and this just doesn't need to be true. You can exercise muscles equally all you want, yet you that doesn't guarantee you will generally have a healthy back. You could still suffer from diseases and get crushed by a boulder or whatever. But see, all that stuff is totally irrelevant for our argument. Our argument just talks about what needs to be true for a healthy back. In order to maintain that, you have to exercise equally. Why? Because having a healthy back depends on balanced muscle development. So you see, there's the gap you need to fill. No one said doing this will get you a healthy back. D says, if the muscles on opposite sides of the spine are exercised unequally, then one's back will be irreparably damaged. We also don't need this to be true. What if we exercise muscles on opposite sides of our spine unequally, yet our back is not just slightly damaged? So how does that hurt? How does that wreck our argument? If anything, I think it might even support our argument, because see, the argument could say something like, see, I told you you need to balance, to get balanced development, you need to do this. So D is not a necessary assumption. We don't need to assume this. E says one should exercise daily in order to ensure that the muscles on opposite sides of the spine keep the back in proper alignment. And what if it's not daily? What if it's like one should exercise once every other day to ensure this? You see, again, it just doesn't have anything. See, this is a tough question because all of these wrong answer choices, they use these words and talk about these concepts that we are talking about in our stimulus, but they're just not the right relationship that we need. The right relationship that we need is something that connects the idea of exercising muscles on the opposite sides of your spine equally to the idea of getting balanced muscle development. And that's what B does. All the other stuff just completely irrelevant to what we're talking about.